Welcome everybody to the Hot Tag Hooligans Wrestling Podcast Show with myself, Aaron, and Tom. Joining us again this week, J.R. Huffman and Aaron Silvers. And tonight on this episode, we're going to break down one of the more underrated parts of pro wrestling, and that is managers and valets. And we're going to break down our top three managers and valets slash assistants slash whichever that you want to call them of all time. How are y'all doing tonight?
Doing
I'm
great.
doing well over here. Pretty excited about this one.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, since you're so excited, we'll let you kick it off, Aaron. Who's your number three best manager slash valet slash assistant or whatever of all time?
All right. I think the interesting way to reveal this is going to be to go through a list of who they've managed. So we'll start off with that. Randy Savage, Harlem Heat, Ric Flair, Shane Douglas, Honky Tonk Man, Doug Summers and Buddy Rose, Shawn Michaels, Ted DiBiase, Marty Jannetty, and Sting. Sherry Martel is my number three. Sensational Sherry. Of course, I didn't get to see her in the early 80s, live. But late 80s through the end of her career, I got to see a lot of her work. And she's definitely had to be listed on this. Had to have some female representation also on this list, I feel, just for the diversity piece of things. But Sherry Martel, I mean, her not just her standing out there being a valet, but she was the wrestling background. She could wrestle before she managed, and she really put a lot into some of the stories that she was involved in. The thing that sticks out to me the biggest was the one where Savage and Warrior are wrestling, and she goes out to Warrior. She's on her knees going through that big spiel with Ultimate Warrior, trying to help him figure out how that was going to go with Savage later in the night. That sticks out huge to me. Her work with Shawn Michaels was second to none. But even going into the Harlem Heat days, one of the most underrated tag teams of that era, in my opinion. But Sherry Martel definitely is my number three.
Yeah, one of the more underrated women's wrestlers of all time as well. Tom, you're number three.
My number three is Miss Elizabeth. When I think about an icon, someone who was part of some of the greatest storylines in pro wrestling history and very impactful storylines. Someone who, when you look back on some of the greatest matches with Hogan and Macho Man and everything in between, she's the staple of that era for me. And she is the glue that held all of that together, in my opinion. Even though, maybe there's some others that have done maybe more things, I just feel like what she did was so iconic that she had to be on the list. So she's my number three.
Miss Elizabeth was also my number three, so we'll dive into her and to piggyback on what you were saying, Tom, as well. For a short, she's probably one of the most important women in wrestling from WrestleMania 4 all the way up till WrestleMania 6 and 7. I mean, she was always involved in the main storyline, whether it be jealousy between Hogan and Savage, or the great reunion with her and Savage later on, getting taken out by, Jake the Snake Roberts and getting bit by the snake. I mean, it just meant a lot, to have a woman's representation, and the fans loved her. She never even cheated to help Savage, which is kind of rare since Savage was the heel. She never helped him in a match that I'm aware of to help him win the match. She always held her ground with him. She had dignity as well, and she's the most iconic female. And like Tom said, she definitely needed representation on the list. It's sad that her career didn't go a little bit longer. Even in WCW years later, they brought her back, to be a part of their programming as well. But Miss Elizabeth for me is a number three. JR.
I would be remiss. I definitely want to say I absolutely love Miss Elizabeth and Sherry Martel. Those are legends in their own time. Much respect to them. I went a little bit different direction, but I couldn't say my pick giving them their flowers. God rest both of them. My pick for my number 3 is Jimmy Hart. Jimmy Hart has been in my life ever since I've been a wrestling fan. He's managed tag teams. He's managed single wrestlers. The man is 85 years old and he's still going. You could plug and play him into, not that they do a lot of managers these days, but he's the type of iconic manager that just stands the test of time. I mean, his antics, the way that he was, and every person that he managed at one time or another held championships. So that's why Jimmy Hart is my number 3 manager of all time.
Awesome. Aaron, you're number 2.
Yeah, so I'm going to tag along there. My number 2 is actually Jimmy Hart. For several of the reasons that JR had there. But again, a huge list of wrestlers there. And I think I need to name a few of those too. And we've got Eddie Gilbert, we got Savage, DiBiase, Flair, Abdullah the Butcher, Adrian Adonis, the Assassins, Austin Idol, Barbarian, Big Bubba, Bill Irwin, Bobby Eaton. The list goes on. Hart Foundation, Nasty Boys, Natural Disasters, the Rougeos, the Mounties, if you will. IRS, Jerry Lawler, it just keeps going on. And on several different organizations. You have WWE, you have the WCW, you have, the Tennessee days way back. But Jimmy Hart is very iconic in several eras for a lot of reasons. And as the list there speaks for itself. And that's not even half the list that I have for Jimmy Hart, but had to put him at number 2. There's no way I could have left him out of the top 3 in my eyes.
I love with Aaron's picks. He's always makes sure to throw out some of those old Mid-South guys. So it's getting really interesting when he starts dropping some of those older names. I'll give him his flowers. He's not on my top 3. But Jimmy Hart's definitely iconic. And I mean, he could manage right now. I mean, that's how, he's that old, but he would still be entertaining as hell if someone would give him a shot right now with some young talent. Could you imagine him with like Austin Theory and Grayson Waller as a tag team right now?
Wow.
It'd be fantastic. Tom, you're number 2.
So my number 2, keep in mind I'm a little bit younger than all 3 of y'all. So my eras of what has influenced me and what I'm very passionate about is a little bit different. And I'm big into characters. I love that side of wrestling. So my number 2 is Paul Bearer. Because, when I think about The Undertaker and his story and him being the greatest character of all time in professional wrestling, Paul Bearer was such an intricate part to that story between him and Kane and The Undertaker. And then, just being that figure and the way he carried himself out there, he told a story just in the looks that he would give. And sometimes it was hilarious, and it just, he just was so important to those stories that I had to put him at number 2. Because for me, when I think of a manager, he's definitely he's the top 2. And he could even, when I talk about my number 1, you'll be able to kind of understand why he wasn't number 1. But he's right there. He's neck and neck. One of my favorite feuds, favorite stories is Undertaker versus Kane, and Paul Bearer is right smack dab in the middle of it. So he's my number 2.
Damn, that's a good pick. It's kind of hard to argue. And let's be honest, you're not a wrestling fan unless you've done the Paul Bearer voice one time. I mean, you're just not. Great pick. For me, number 2, I'm going to catch a lot of shit for this. It's Paul Heyman. I mean, I get what everybody's saying about Hart and Bear, and neither one of them made my list. But Paul Heyman, for decades now, has been just turning out talent. And let's be honest, I'm so shocked. As good as he was in his early WCW days, he's on another level right now as the advocate, whether it be for Lesnar or Roman Reigns. He makes you care. He's one of the best speakers in all of pro wrestling. If Paul Bearer was a wrestler and he could really wrestle well, he'd probably main event because he can talk and he's so integral, he's so devious. His Dangerous Alliance is a who's who of Hall of Famers. And I really believe in those days, Heyman really did help guide those guys sometimes. Maybe he really was, that voice for them to lean on. And I know Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns, who are the biggest names of all time now, have leaned on him as far as his wisdom and how to perform as better. So Paul Heyman for me is my number 2. JR.
Paul Heyman is also my number 2. I followed Paul Heyman ever since he was a young man. He did a couple of stints in the Mid-South and Smoky Mountain Wrestling just for a brief time. And you will hear other managers and other people say, Paul Heyman has evolved in everything that he's done. Because when I watched his character back way in the day when he had that big cell phone with the Dangerous Alliance, then he had ECW. He owned ECW. ECW fell through. And then there was a variated version of his company. And all the things that you just mentioned there, he created that type of relationship and created those champions after that happened. I mean, all of the failures and the setbacks that he had only elevated him. I'll even go as far as to say he is a very intricate part in how long this bloodline story has lasted. I mean, we have Roman Reigns and you have all these intricate parts, but the director, the producer, and the one running the show has always been Paul Heyman. He is the one that has elevated every one of them. The Usos were, Universal or unanimous champions for what, 2 years, almost 2 years. He elevated every single person that was with him, and he continues to do so. So Paul Heyman is my number 2 as well.
All right, Aaron, before we get to your number 1, who's an honorable mention for you?
If I want to put anybody out there, Heyman's already been mentioned on some of the lists, so I'm not going to put him as an honorable mention. He's definitely there. But one I think that kind of is forgotten sometimes is Mr. Fuji. Mr. Fuji for me, always, I don't know of him ever being a face, but always led some great heel teams. So Mr. Fuji for me, including the Demolition and the Powers of Pain, and list goes on, the Orient Express. Fuji was great. I mean, and again, he's another one of those that I didn't even see him in his prime. I've seen him later on in his career, and I missed his wrestling days because of course, ex-wrestler also. But Fuji is definitely an honorable mention for me. I can't forget to mention him.
Tom, honorable mention for you.
Hold on. So my honorable mention has to be the most famous professional wrestling lawyer, Smart Mark Sterling Esquire.
And you got to be kidding
I love
me.
everything he does. From trying to legitimately manage his talent to trying to make sure they get the best deals brokered. I mean, you can't say he didn't do a good job for Jade. She just signed that big WWE contract.
So he got fired.
So I mean, it's he's definitely one that I like to watch. To me, he's the only reason to watch Ring of Honor, but I'm a weirdo and I don't really watch it unless it's his segment. I just think he does a really good job at playing that character. And I would like to see more of that, but he's definitely my honorable mention.
One of my honorable mentions outside of the normal people that we've kind of mentioned and thrown out there is J.J. Dillon. One of the more integral parts of the Four Horsemen, and he would take his whoopings too. Everybody wanted to get their hands on JJ as just as much as they did Flair and Tully and Arn, sometimes as well. A great character for WCW and NWA back in the day. I don't think JJ Dillon gets his dues as much. When they talk Four Horsemen, they always talk about the members more than they do JJ Dillon. But he was definitely someone that you needed to pay attention to. JR?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and say it. Aaron, you stole my honorable mention, but I had a backup because I had a feeling nobody was going to leave that man off. His mannerisms, the way he carried himself in the interviews, set him apart from anybody else that managed, whether they're in a stable, a tag team, or single wrestlers. And I absolutely love James J. Dillon. But Aaron already knows who I'm about to, because I have a long track record with this man. I've been following him, and probably one of my favorite tag teams of all times, other than the Road Warriors, is the Midnight Express, and I'm going with Jim Cornette. Jim Cornette has been an integral part. He managed Yokozuna. He's been a manager, and he's always been, he set his own style, his own way. A lot of people hate on Jim Cornette, but I will say I'm a super fan. I always have been. And he's a legend in his own right. But I will say he signed a figure for me and said, thank you for being a fan, but I'm not the number one manager. But I'll leave it at that. Jim Cornette's my honorable mention.
JR, I think, JR, that Jim Cornette is probably the closest to Mr. Lenny Sevens that I've ever seen, if I had to guess. And I think you know who Lenny Sevens is.
Yeah, we have a pretty good relationship. I keep him in check. I'm his voice of reason.
Correct.
Yeah. Lenny Sevens aside, Aaron, who's your number one?
Number one, I have a feeling I won't be the only one on this one, but number one for me is Bobby Heenan. The Heenan with the Heenan family, and the longest list that I found of the people that I was researching of folks that he's managed. And, you know, I won't go through that list because it's so long, but Bobby Heenan, from wrestler to manager to even commentator, he's gold. Anything that he did was gold. Again, he was one that I never seen as a face manager, always with the heels, but always elevated everyone around him, and was always that made his segments the most entertaining. He, again, to your point with JJ Dillon, he took his whoopings also. You know, there was plenty of times Hogan got a hold of him in a cage or whatever it may be. But Bobby Heenan for sure. And again, some unfortunate things, and, you know, he's no longer with us, but Bobby Heenan is legendary in my eyes, even though he was one that I hated when I was a kid.
Tom.
So, again, I'm a little younger than y'all. So, Bobby Heenan's great, but I have no emotional attachment. Like, I don't have anything there. So, that's what everyone always says. And, you know, even the legends themselves will say the greatest manager of all time is Bobby Heenan. So, I don't want to take anything away from him. But for me, the number one is Paul Heyman. For all of the reasons that you guys said for your number two, he is my number one. The longevity of his career, the ability to make himself the star of the moment without overshadowing the superstars in the ring is a talent that not very many people have. Because he is gold in every segment that he is in, but he is not there to outshine who he's with. He makes them better. But if you are watching what is happening, you can really appreciate what he is doing in the moment. Just the way he looks at talent when somebody says something, the way he can change the direction of a conversation just by a pause before he starts to speak. Just everything that he does, he takes you into that moment better than I feel like anyone else does. Just all across the board is very talented, and in that role, I think he does that role better than anyone else, especially when it comes to making the talent around him better for being with him.
My number one is Bobby the Brain Heenan. You know, just totally legendary, even outside of just managerial, his excellence. He's also one of the best color commentators of all time. With primetime wrestling, him and Gorilla Monsoon sitting there at the desk and just making a wisecrack, and Gorilla saying, "Will you stop?" It was always so great, you know, those two together. And even when you would pair Heenan with someone like a Ric Flair, someone who was super established already and didn't even need a manager, Heenan made Flair even better. And just one of the legendary people. I wish he was around a whole lot longer than what he was. I understand what you're saying that you didn't have an emotional attachment to him, but he was my childhood. I was able to see him one time at Disc Jockey at the Evansville Eastland Mall. He was there signing autographs one time, and me and my sister thought it was the greatest thing because he was just making wisecracks to everybody who was in the line, and it was so good to see him. But the Weasel himself, Bobby the Brain Heenan, is my number one. JR?
Well, I have to finish out with I had to do a lot of soul searching on these managers because a lot of these from my childhood we've mentioned, and much respect to Tom putting Paul Heyman there. That was a really hard choice. I was really teetering between that and Bobby the Brain Heenan. One of the most iconic things, and I don't think anybody else could have pulled this off, is when Bobby Heenan called the match when Hogan turned heel. The way that he brought that in, he is the one that broke my heart. It wasn't Hogan that broke my heart. It was Bobby Heenan. And I'm speaking to him on a commentator stance. The way that he made me feel that Hulk Hogan really did betray the entire world of wrestling. And it was the way that Bobby Heenan brought that across. And when he was managing, the way that he carried that, he's the only person I believe that could have made me hate Andre the Giant. I loved Andre the Giant, but when he became his manager, and he made all the sense as to why Andre the Giant should take on Hulk Hogan. So that was another factor, along with all the attributes that you all said, that Bobby Heenan, why he is the greatest manager of all time. And now I can reveal that Jim Cornette signed my signature for his figure, and it says, I am a great manager, but Bobby Heenan will always be number one. So that was pretty easy for me to pick him as my number one because I got Jim Cornette's okay to do so too. So Bobby Heenan, number one for me too.
Awesome. Well, like I said, there were so many. I love that Paul Bearer pick by Tom. It was just kind of one of those. As great as he was, he just wasn't sticking in my mind. And Tom said him. I was like, man, I totally forgot about Bearer in a way. And that's a good thing about always doing these lists. And the next time you see all four of us together, here's the topic. I'm gonna go ahead and throw it out right now. Your 3 favorite matches of all time. 3 favorite matches of all time. Not necessarily the best matches we've ever seen. Our 3 favorite matches of all time. I think that'll be really good. And I think the scope of that'll be crazy. And there'll probably be some matches some of us haven't even seen that'll be mentioned. So that'll be good too. So, all right, guys, I appreciate y'all as always. For everyone out there, make sure you're doing what you need to do. There's a lot of wrestling shows popping up everywhere right now. It's a good time for wrestling, good time to go out to see a show if you're able to do that as well. Make sure you hit that subscribe button for us. For myself, Tom, Aaron, and JR, we appreciate y'all as always. Stay safe and enjoy your week.